The purpose of this class this video is to go over the Civil War History Unit 2 essay, the Emancipation Proclamation essay, and I'm recording this so that you can watch this and walk away with a solid plan of attack for your essay, so it will turn out to be a good essay. If you are using this, go ahead and have a piece of paper handy or a Word document. There will be a couple places where you might want to put some notes. So with that, let's go ahead and move to the next slide, and let's get through this essay topic. By the way, the picture that you see on the front of this is a statue in Washington, D.C. of Lincoln, and this kind of shows the Emancipation Proclamation you can see there. So let's move forward here. Okay, next slide. On January 1st, 1863, President Lincoln, here's our essay topic, sorry my headphones aren't working so well here, issued the historic Emancipation Proclamation. The proclamation immediately granted the freedom of only 50,000 slaves, but it proclaimed the freedom of 3.1 million of the nation's 4 million slaves at the time to be freed as the Union Army advanced through the Confederacy. Write a detailed and well-researched essay explaining how the Emancipation Proclamation can be seen as a strategic move to help the North win the Civil War. That's the interesting thing about the Emancipation Proclamation. You know, we look back on it now 100 years later, or over 100 years later, and we think about, you know, freedom and liberty and the goodness of this proclamation. But what's interesting at the time, this was a strategic move by Abraham Lincoln. You know, this happens we're over a year into the war, things are going rough, and Lincoln is trying to figure out how to make this war winnable, and his mind evolves to the Emancipation Proclamation. So what I'm going to do before we go over the actual essay itself, I'm going to give you a little bit of background information on the proclamation. As I go over each of these things, what I want you to keep in your mind is this idea of a strategic move. What does strategy mean? What's the point of this? And because I want you to look through that lens as you see this information. Let me move to the next slide. This was something that Lincoln had said at one point during the Civil War, and it's an interesting quote. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. If I could save the Union, and if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. Which, by the way, interestingly enough, is what he did in the Emancipation. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save this Union. And what I forbear because I do not believe it would help to save the Union. I have here stated my purpose according to my view of official duty, and I intend no modification of my oft-expressed personal wish that all men everywhere could be free. What Lincoln is saying here is, although he personally was against slavery, that was in the background to him of preserving the Union. And again, you can see here, and I don't think he's lying in this, because he actually took one of these courses of action. He's saying, if I freed all the slaves, if I thought that would save the Union, I'd do it. If I thought freeing no slave would save the Union, I'd do it. And if I thought that freeing some slaves and leaving others alone would save the Union, I would do that as well. And what he's pointing out here is his number one concern is freeing the Union, and also that he's willing to do whatever it takes to free the Union. Now let's go and look at some more background. This is a picture of Scott's Great Snake, and you already know from your lessons, this is Scott's Great Snake is the Anaconda Plan. One of the cornerstones of the Union strategy in the Civil War was to blockade the South, and ultimately by blockading the South, they knew they would destroy them, because the Union economy was twice as strong as the Southern economy, and basically if the war lasted a long time, if they could just basically isolate the South economically, that would take its toll. And so what I'm trying to point out here is in the background, and this is something Lincoln would have known, ultimately the Union was much stronger than the Confederacy economically. Moving along. And if the Union could just stop the Confederate from exporting anything, they would ultimately win the war. Here's more background. Another thing that Lincoln was thinking about in 1862, what would Britain do? See, the South understood when the war began that there was no way they could ever really win unless they had France or Britain's help. And so one of the things throughout the Civil War that the South was constantly trying to do was they were constantly trying to enlist the aid of Britain or France in helping them. And they felt that if Britain especially, because Britain was the #1 cotton buyer from the South. Most of the South's cotton came from, or most of Britain's cotton came from the South. The South knew that if Britain jumped in on their side, then what would happen eventually is the Union would just back off, and you'd have two United States of America, the Confederate States of America and the United States of America, or the Union. Now, here's the interesting thing about this. Britain was an anti-slave country. So I've got two pictures here. I've got the cotton. You can see a cotton field, and you see slaves picking that cotton in the background. And the picture in the foreground, this was from a modern movie. I think they called it Amazing Grace, and it was the story of William Wilberforce. Wilberforce was a preacher and someone who served in English Parliament, who was ultimately he dedicated his entire life to fighting the slavery in Britain. And in 1833, he finally won that battle. The actor that plays him is a Fantastic Four guy. I can't remember his name. But in 1833, he wins that battle. Britain is against slavery. Now, you would think if Britain was against slavery, they would be against the South, but here was the problem. The South was their cotton supply. And a second problem. The North is not exactly against slavery. As far as everybody can tell from everything Lincoln is saying and from everything everyone is saying, this is a war about states' rights. It's a war about preserving the Union, keeping the Union together, but what it's not is a war about slavery. If it becomes a war about slavery, then it becomes very tough for Britain to support the South because the British people are against slavery. This is what's going on in Lincoln's mind in 1862. More background. Again, as I mentioned, the Northern economy is heavily industrial, and it's made up of free laborers. Nothing is hurting the Northern economy. The Southern economy is mostly agricultural, and it's based on slave labor. Any move that affects the slaves is going to have a dramatic impact on the Southern economy, probably in a negative way. For example, if slaves are freed, if you have an Emancipation Proclamation that frees slaves in enemy territory, as the army marches through, the minute the army comes within 30 or 40 miles of any plantation, suddenly the slaves disappear like that. And that indeed is exactly what happened after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. Now, what that does is that grinds the Southern economy to a halt anywhere near where the Northern Army comes in. Every time the Northern Army moves, wherever it goes, the Southern economy stops with it. And of course, that's going to hurt the South. Meanwhile, the Northern economy continues to boom and boom and boom. The other thing that was happening by September of 1862 is you have the battles of the Civil War were starting to take an enormous toll. When you look at the Second Battle of Bull Run, the combined killed and wounded for the Union was 10,000 men. The combined killed and wounded for the Confederates was 7,000 men. This was not a little skirmish. And what everyone was beginning to realize by 1862 is that this war was going to be a tough, long, drawn-out war. Things were getting very serious. Here's another example, Battle of Antietam. Union losses in the Battle of Antietam, 12,401 casualties with 2,100 dead. This was a battle that lasted about 3 days. Confederate losses. Confederate casualties were 10,318 total casualties with 1,546 dead. Now, to put this into perspective, this single battle, the casualties in this single battle, represented 25% of the Federal force and 31% of the Confederate force. That is huge. We don't have those kind of casualties today when we fight battles. And so what was happening by the fall of 1862 is everything was getting much more serious with this war, and people realized, my goodness, we've got to do something. We got to make this count, and we have to do something to end this war because we can't go on fighting, having these kind of casualties forever. I mean, if we fight like this for 10 years, there's going to be nobody left in America. And that's one of the things we don't think about today with the Civil War is, You know, it was the war that we had that caused more casualties than any other war, about 1 million total casualties. And at the time, this is, you know, our nation only had a population of maybe 30 million. That's a lot of people. We've never suffered anything like that ever since. And so there was this sense of urgency. Lincoln realized that if he didn't do something to step up the North's game and something to make it to where the North could win the war, then eventually the people of the North would lose heart and they wouldn't want to fight the war anymore, and the South would win. Because the South knew they couldn't win. All they needed to do was make the North stop fighting and make peace, and then they've won. So Lincoln realized that this is happening by the fall of 1862. So what happens is he thinks about this. He realizes that the War Powers Act gives the president extra powers during wartime. And what's interesting about the Emancipation Proclamation is the reason that Lincoln could do this is under the War Powers Act, any contraband that is captured during time of war, any property that is captured, is the property of the President of the United States, because he's the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Army. You know, you don't think about that, but when an army marches into a territory and it captures things, the Army now owns all the property in that territory. And so because of that, Lincoln realized there was never any way in 1862 that Lincoln could have passed the Emancipation Proclamation in Congress. It would have got shot down even without the Southern senators. Americans were not ready for something like that at that time. But he realized, wait a minute, I don't even need to go to Congress, because under the War Powers Act, which is built into the Constitution, I have the legal power and authority to do this, and then we can worry about the effects of this later. So what ends up happening is he issues the Emancipation Proclamation on the 22nd of September in 1862, and this is another interesting piece about this proclamation. It takes effect on January 1st, 1863. In other words, there's this whole October, November, December, there's more than 3 months between when this is issued and when this takes effect. Look at the wording of this. That on the first day of January in the year of our Lord 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then thenceforward and forever free, and the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authority thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons, and will do no act or acts to repress such persons or any of them in any efforts they make for their actual freedom. So what's interesting, this doesn't free, the only slaves that this frees are the slaves in rebel states, in states who are actively in rebellion. If your state is not actively in rebellion, this does not free any slave in your state. Now, think about strategic here. Why a 3-month lag time? Lincoln is giving the South 3 months to consider whether they want to just surrender and keep their slaves, or whether they want to continue fighting and lose their slaves and run the risk of their slaves being free. Why did he issue this proclamation? How might this help him win the war? Well, think about it. There's a number of things that this does. The South, by the way, didn't take the bait. They continued to fight. Now let's get to the essay topic itself. On January 1st, 1863, President Lincoln issued the historic Emancipation Proclamation. The proclamation immediately granted the freedom of only 50,000 slaves. Not very many, but it proclaimed the freedom of 3.1 million of the nation's 4 million slaves at the time to be freed as the Union Army advanced through the Confederacy. Write a detailed and well-researched essay explaining how the Emancipation Proclamation can be seen as a strategic move to help the North win the Civil War. Now, the first step to writing an essay is turn the topic into a question with a question mark. For this particular essay, the question that we're asking was, how was the Emancipation Proclamation a strategic move to help the North win the Civil War? The reason it's important to turn the question into the topic into a question with a question mark is it does two things. First of all, it clarifies what you're going to be writing about. You need to answer the question, how was this a strategic move to help the North win the war? The second reason this is important is because your answer for this question is going to go into your intro paragraph and becomes a very important statement in your essay that we know of as the thesis statement. you can test your thesis statement against this question. And if your thesis statement looks good next to the question, you have a solid thesis statement. If it looks bad next to the question, you don't. For example, if someone said, how was the Emancipation Proclamation a strategic move to help the North win the Civil War? And the answer was, donkeys live a long time, no one's ever seen a dead donkey. We have a problem there. That's not a good thesis statement. So it's important to turn the topic into a question with a question mark. If you are taking notes right now, this is a good time to pause this video and write the question down. Now, basically, looking at the background information that we have a few answers for this. You know, strategy is your plan to win the war, right? Well, slaves are the basis of the Southern economy. By freeing the slaves, what happens is every time the Union Army moves into an area, every slave from miles around flocks to the Union Army, which, by the way, under this Emancipation Proclamation, the Union Army is bound by law to protect those slaves, which that's another thing that's kind of interesting about this. As soon as the war began, everywhere the Union Army went, the slaves went to it. And so one of the things that was kind of funny about the Emancipation Proclamation is, in some ways, it was a reaction to a reality that was already happening. As early as 1861, Lincoln was getting letters from his generals saying, hey, we have like 10,000 slaves that are kind of following our army. What do we do with these people? Do we feed them? Do we get them to work for us? I mean, do we tell them to go away? I mean, what are we supposed to do? And what ended up working out is they said, well, go ahead and feed them and use them in whatever ways you can. So the slaves would build fortifications, helping the slaves were willing to fight. And by the end of the war, by the way, that was the other one, there were many ex-slaves that were serving in the Union Army as soldiers, which boosted the ranks of men. I mean, to the tune of something like 150,000 or something. It was a lot of slaves that they put into uniform and helped fight. The other thing that the Emancipation Proclamation does, it helps Britain to side with the Union and not the Confederacy. Once the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, now this wasn't just a war about states' rights. This wasn't just a war about preserving the Union. It was, in fact, a war about slavery. When that happens, Britain can't support the Confederacy anymore. Which, by the way, the other thing that helped Britain not support the Confederacy is this was really hurting cotton production. And one of the interesting kind of subtle things that happens during the Civil War, Britain begins to plant a lot of cotton in India because their source in America dried up during this war. And from that point on, the South, after the war, the South is going to have to rebuild a new economy that is not quite as reliant on cotton, because they don't have their old best customer anymore, because Britain's now buying cotton from places like Egypt and India. But the slavery thing was big. The British people were very against slavery, and once the North came out decidedly against slavery, well, then Britain no longer really had the choice to support the South. The other thing that this does is it helps the Union Army and it hurts the Confederate Army. If you think about this, there are several reasons for that. I mean, one, the Union Army keeps getting these people that are coming to help them to build trenches or dig trenches and build fortifications and do laundry and help with the wounded. And even before they put ex-slaves into the field as soldiers, the slaves were helping the Union Army in several ways. The other thing that happens, as far as the other side of this, it hurts the Confederate Army. The Confederates knew that every time the Union Army came into an area, they had to really spend a lot of energy watching the slaves, because the slaves were going to disappear and go join the Union Army. So it diverts needed troops from the front to the back to make sure that slaves are not disappearing and going. So with that, these are three reasons that, and there's probably a lot more reasons, but here are three credible and good reasons that you could actually write a lot about how the Emancipation Proclamation helps the North and hurts the South. Okay. Once you've turned the topic into a question with a question mark, and you can see it up there, the next step in writing your essay is creating an essay map, or what I call an essay map. If your essay is 5 paragraphs, well, hang on, I'm getting ahead of myself. All essays are made of 3 pieces. They're made of an intro, body, and a conclusion. Your standard high school essay is usually a multi-paragraph essay, maybe a 5-paragraph essay. So if that's the case, you know you're always going to have an intro, you know you're always going to have a conclusion. So basically what you need to do when you're writing an essay is you've got to come up with how many body paragraphs you're going to have and what is going to be the subject of those body paragraphs. Let's say we answer this in a 5-paragraph format. We know we're going to have an intro para. We know we're going to have a conclusion. All we have to do is come up with 3 ways that the Emancipation Proclamation helps the North win the war. Well, going back to the slide before, we have 3 ways. So what ends up happening when we go to write our essay map, we know the first paragraph in the essay is going to be the intro para. The second paragraph, which sometimes is known as the body paragraph 1, or I also call it main point 1, hurts the Southern economy. This is one way that the Emancipation Proclamation helps the North win the war. Here's a second way. It hurts the South's relationship with Britain. Here's a third way. Helps the Union military. And then, of course, we finish this with a conclusion. If you are taking notes right now, what you want to do is you want to write down this essay map. I've taught essays for a lot of years, and one of the things that I've learned over the years as I taught essays is if students have an essay map, if you have a few words that describes what each of your paragraphs is doing, it really helps you come up with a much better essay, and it also actually helps you write the essay a lot quicker. Because what happens when you've got an essay map is you know where to put the information. I know that in my first body paragraph, all I'm going to talk about is the Southern economy. I'm not going to talk about the Southern military or the South's relationship with Britain. Those are going to go in other body paragraphs. I'm simply going to talk about the Southern economy in that paragraph. When I get to the second body paragraph, I'm going to focus on the South's relationship with Britain. Maybe I'm going to mention that piece of legislation where Britain outlawed slavery in 1833, and Lincoln knew that by jumping on this he would help. And then of course I go to the third one and I'm going to talk about the military. What an essay map does is it helps us put information in the right place, and I guarantee you, using an essay map, things go much, much, much quicker. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Now, you remember that when you get an essay topic, the first thing you want to do is turn the topic into a question with a question mark. When you go to write your 3 body paragraphs, the first sentence of each body paragraph is called your topic sentence. I sometimes refer to it as a TS. When you write that topic sentence, each of your topic sentences, and actually each of your body paragraphs as a whole, need to address the topic question in a topic-specific way. Remember, our topic question was, how was the Emancipation Proclamation a strategic move to help the North win the war? So we determined that there were 3 ways that it did that. It hurt the Southern economy, hurt South's relationship with Britain, and it helps the Union military. So what we do is we rephrase the topic question to reflect that. So for main point 1 in that body paragraph, I'm going to address the question of how did the Emancipation Proclamation hurt the Southern economy. First, I answer that question in 1 sentence. That becomes my topic sentence, and then generally I answer it throughout the entire body paragraph, because the topic sentence is like a 1-sentence summary of an entire paragraph. Then of course when I get to my second paragraph, I answer the question again, just slightly differently. How did the Emancipation Proclamation hurt the South's relationship with Britain? And in my third body paragraph, how did the Emancipation Proclamation help the Union military? So with that, I've got these 3 topic sentences, and I answer these 3 questions. That becomes my body paragraphs. We have 1 slide to go, and then we're done with this. Okay, last slide. The other thing that you need to remember when you go to write this essay is that each body paragraph must do 2 things. It must describe the topic, and then it must explain how this would help the Union win the war. So like, let's say the first one. You talk about hurting the Southern economy. You want to talk about the South and cotton production, and you want to talk about how the slaves were the basis of cotton production, and then in the second part of this, you need to explain how this helps, and of course, obviously, if the slaves leave the plantations, that's going to stop cotton production, it's going to stop agriculture, which is going to grind the economy to a halt, and of course, this isn't happening in the North, so that's describing the topic. The next thing that you do is you need to explain how this helps the Union win the war. That's where you come in and you bring these details out of your own mind. You say, now, if the Southern economy is ground to the halt, while the Northern economy is going strong, This is not going to help the South. This is going to help the North. They're still cranking out rifles. The South is cranking out nothing. We've got a real problem on our hands. The description, the information in a body paragraph, that's the kind of stuff you get out of Wikipedia. That's the kind of stuff you get out of your lessons. That's the facts and the numbers and the figures. The explanation has to come from your mind. And so in each of these body paragraphs, you're going to have about 6 to 8 sentences, and you simply do, if you need to do 2 things, you can count and say, okay, in 3 or 4 sentences, I'm going to describe some information here, and in another 3 or 4 sentences, I'm going to explain that information. And so when you do that, that gives you everything that you need for this particular essay, and that should give you a plan of attack. I'm hoping by watching this short video, you have a good idea of what you're going to do in this essay, and I'm hoping that you're coming away from this video saying, okay, I think I know what I'm going to do. I think I know how I'm going to organize this essay, and I think I know what information is going to go in here. If this was not enough and you need additional help, please feel free to get a hold of me, and thank you for watching my video. Take care. Bye-bye.